a sustainable student farm at the University of Illinois. I grew up in Champaign County on the University of Illinois, and my grandparents have a pretty large, or had a pretty large garden all growing up. So I think I learned how to pick peas before I learned how to walk. So I've been growing vegetables for a very long time. Went to the U of I for natural resources and environmental science, and then grad school in Northern Colorado at Colorado State for human dimensions of natural resources, which is sort of like sociology, social psychology, and then worked for the USDA for a few years, and then moved back to Champaign, where I taught for 3 semesters at the U of I, vegetable gardening and small farms, and then I switched over to extension this past December, and I'm a local foods and what is my title? Local food systems and small farms educator for Champaign, Ford, Iroquois, and Vermilion counties here in East Central Illinois. So some of the veggies that you can plant now keep in mind, everyone, I know a lot of people in the chat said that several of you are kind of from all over. So I am talking in terms of our climate here in Central Illinois. We are in zone 5, so keep that in mind. And we'll talk a little bit about how to make adjustments for the dates of things. So veggies that you can plant relatively now, some of these were sort of a few weeks ago, but we're gonna talk about peas, greens, several different root crops, herbs, and onions. Here we go. Okay, so for Urbana, Illinois, on this map, it is on the very lower portion of the blue section. So hopefully you all can see that okay. It is actually one of the labels on there. So for Central Illinois and up to the Chicago region, other than actual Chicago proper, but most of the suburbs around Chicago, these are the dates that are going to apply. If you are in the Rockford area, these dates are going to be a little bit earlier. So for example, the spinach planting on September 16th for the Rockford area is probably September 1st. But we're gonna talk about season extension, so some of these dates don't really matter at all. But if you're planting outside in the ground with no season extension, these are the dates that apply. And then Southern Illinois is going to be a couple weeks later. And then for you all that said that you are in New Mexico or Arizona, you're at a very different planting zone. So you probably have another month and a half before you really have to worry about planting some of these things. So for peas, we have August 7th. So that one is pretty far past. Very Southern Illinois probably can get away with it. For our greens, we're looking at lettuce, and this is probably not head lettuce, but leaf lettuce. So like a salad mix type lettuce where it's individual leaves. A head lettuce is probably going to take too long. So lettuce and Swiss chard at the beginning of September. Spinach is a little bit more cold hardy. So that is tomorrow, or is today the 16th? Yeah, tomorrow. You can plant your spinach. Baby kale, September 22nd, so next week. And these are all leaf lettuces or leafy greens that you're going to harvest pretty young. So there are some others that I didn't list on here that you can still grow, such as arugula. So a lot of those basic salad mixes or salad greens, you can still grow, still plant, and you'll just harvest them early. Generally with something like a baby kale or a spinach or a leaf lettuce, you could get several cuttings off of it. Planting this late, you'll get 1 or 2 before frost really kills it, if you're using no season extension items. For season extension, you can grow spinach here in Central Illinois year-round. It will stall a little bit in our really cold month of February, but if you use proper season extension, you can really grow salad greens year-round. And then for root crops, I've listed carrots, beets, and turnips. Something like a parsnip is going to take too many days. So planting it in the fall this late, it wouldn't mature enough to really have anything substantial to eat. A parsnip would need to be planted like in the beginning of July. And then one I didn't put on here is radishes, and that's because radishes only take like 22 days. So you can really plant those at any point. If you're using some season extension to warm up your soil, you can plant radishes and grow them. And something else that I will touch on is growing things in pots. And I love growing radishes inside in pots throughout the winter. It's a thing that you can get to grow, and then you get a nice fresh vegetable in the middle of winter, which is really nice. And then herbs, I've listed cilantro and parsley. Parsley is a little bit, takes a little bit longer to mature than cilantro. So this is an August 1st date. So it's probably a little bit too late to plant outside, even with season extension probably for most of central Illinois. Cilantro, you could still plant outside, but a lot of herbs grow really well in pots indoors. So that's a really nice one to grow in your kitchen window or in a centerpiece on your table. Other herbs that we'll talk about a little bit would be things that get larger, such as rosemary, sage. Those are plants that are long living and will grow into a larger bush. So that's something that you want to grow probably in a larger pot. And in the future, you would want to move that outside in the summer and then bring it inside for the winter. If you're just starting with these plants, you can grow them in some smaller pots for this year, and then maybe plant them outside. Some of those aren't going to be cold hardy enough for anywhere north of our light blue area. So most rosemaries and sages will survive a central Illinois winter, but potentially not further north. It's kind of an iffy line. So I like to keep a lot of these things in pots, and I move them outside in the summer and then bring them back in for the winter. And then the other thing that can still be planted are scallions. Again, central Illinois, it's a little bit late, but if you're using some season extension, you'll be okay. And so scallions are also known as bunching onions, which is what our example on the next page says. So here we'll kind of talk about how to determine the planting dates for wherever you are. So I pulled some screenshots from Johnny Seeds. So that's where the picture on the right-hand side are screenshots from their webpage, which is basically the information that you would find on a seed packet. I just couldn't get a good picture of a seed packet that I really liked, and this looked nicer. So here we can see that the days to maturity for bunching onions, which is what we're looking at here, which are scallions, is 65 days. And our first frost in the fall is an average of October 15th. So we want to take October 15th minus 65 days, and that gives you the date that you want to plant something outside to make sure that you're going to be able to harvest it. It will be fully mature and harvestable before we get our first frost. Now, some other things to keep in mind when you're figuring out this planting date is if the plant can survive a frost. So things like our root crops actually benefit from going through a first frost or maybe a couple of light frosts. The plant will change some of its starches into sugars, so they actually become sweeter if they go through a frost. This is also true for spinach. Is pretty good if it goes through one light frost, not a heavy frost, just an hour, 30 minutes overnight where it gets a little bit cold. That can make it a little bit sweeter, but most things will want to be covered. So this is obviously an average date. It's changing all of the time. This year, according to the Farmer's Almanac, it is supposed to be a little bit warmer in October than it typically has been. So this is good news for some of those things that I was like, oh, you should have planted it last week or 2 weeks ago. We might be okay. If it does actually stay warmer, our first frost will be later than October 15th. So that means you can plant a little bit later. So these are just average dates, and if hopefully all of you have grown something before and you know that sometimes things just don't make it, and that's okay. You can plant a few seeds, and if we get a really early frost and you lose some stuff, well, at least you tried. So I think you could still go ahead and try to plant a lot of these. And again, we will go over some season extension. Some other things to keep in mind are daylight hours. So when this says 65 days to maturity, that is considering that you're going to be planting it during like a normal time. So more like the spring and summer. They aren't really expecting that you're going to be planting this in a covered greenhouse or trying to grow it inside through the winter. So plants are actually based on daylight hours, not actual days. So 65 days is sort of assuming a certain number of daylight hours. So when we're planting later in the season than what these companies are expecting us to, you have to assume it might take a few more actual calendar days for that plant to come to be ready to be harvested. So just keep that in mind. If you plant stuff to try to grow it inside or in a tunnel through the winter, if it takes longer than 65 days to mature, it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It's just we have, a lot less sunlight through fall and winter than we do in the summer, obviously. So just be patient and don't overwater thinking that it's not getting enough. That's another one I didn't put on here, but yeah, don't overwater. So also soil temperature and germination temperature. So most seeds want to germinate at a higher temperature than what that the plant wants to grow at. So on this photo on the right, you can also see that it has this germination guide. So we have the temperature for germination is between 77 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So that means you really want nice warm temperatures for these seeds to germinate and start growing. And then if the plant is growing at 65 degrees, especially for something like spinach, that's totally fine, even a lower temperature, but you really need to warm up the soil to get the seeds to grow. So starting things inside where you can control that temperature is still a good idea, and then transplant outside, or just warming up the soil with a greenhouse plastic or a row cover, which we'll talk about in just a minute, is a good idea when you first try to get these plants going. So get them started now while we are still getting some nice sunlight, the soil is warming up, and then you can cover them and grow things throughout the winter. Pests are still a problem, especially if you do something where you're creating a nice warm space that is protected from wind and snow. In the middle of winter, the bunnies are still going to want to get in there and eat your lovely fresh lettuce in the nice little warm greenhouse that you have created. So make sure that you're still looking out for pests. You can also still have lots of insect pests and stuff like that throughout the whole winter. So just keep an eye on your plants and just know that even though it's winter and everything outside seems to be dormant and sleeping and the insects are all gone, they might still show up in your lettuce beds if you have them nice and covered. And then we can do season extension. So I've mentioned that a few times already. So if you haven't planted stuff yet, there's still a chance, and you just need a few more materials to help you grow all the way through the winter. So for season extension, we have 4 main things to help us out, and then also growing inside, which I won't go into too much, but we do have the row cover, which is the white fabric looking thing that you can see here. So in that top photo, it is held up by some metal hoops. You can also use PVC pipes, which they can bend for you, really anything to create an elevation. So they sell packets of these pre-curved half circle metal hoops that you can use. Generally, wherever they are selling this row cover, they will also sell those. So those are pretty cheap. You just line them down your row about 3 feet apart. You could do closer spacing if you want. And then you use this cloth, cloth-like fabric. It does tear pretty easily, so you want to be careful when you're putting it on not to stab it with those metal hoops. Because then if there's a hole in it, the bugs can get in easier and you're not providing as much protection, and the air can get out. And this is creating like a nice blanket over your plants. Or you don't have to use the hoops. And that second picture in the middle on the left, that is a picture of the row cover just laying directly on top of what I'm assuming is spinach. So you really are just putting a blanket directly on top of the plants. Some people will also use sheets and stuff like that, bed sheets. So you don't necessarily have to buy anything special, but if you're really going to try to grow things all year long, investing in some of this stuff is a really good idea. So to hold down the row cover, we have two examples in these photos that I've already mentioned. One is piling the soil from around it, from the row or the walkway next to it, pile that up on the edge to hold it down. You can do that with pretty easily with just a hoe or a shovel and just kind of throw some dirt clods over. Or you can use bricks or stones or sandbags, just anything really to weight it down. If you can hold down the entire edge, that's really going to keep, your pests, like the bunnies and the squirrels, from being able to get in there. They'll have to at least work a little bit harder. Obviously, the squirrels will be able to tear their way in, but at least you have to make them work a little bit harder for it. And then this top photo also shows black plastic on the soil. So this is really more of like a spring getting started early photo, but that black plastic will help warm the soil. So that is something else that you could use. You can double up on the row cover. So if you are growing the spinach, you can put the blanket directly on top of your spinach, as well as having that hoop over the top. So that's just really going to create a double layer. You can also use a greenhouse plastic on that hoop and create your own little greenhouse. You can put the blanket inside directly on top overnight. And then if you have that nice plastic hoop house going over the top, and grow your spinach and greens and root crops and all kinds of stuff much later in the season. You can use greenhouse plastic as well, which I don't have a photo of this, but if you have something like a tomato cage, you can wrap that with the greenhouse plastic as well as put one over the top, and you basically create a cylindrical greenhouse. So that's a way to keep some of your tomato plants or pepper plants or anything else that you have growing outside right now. As we start to get to those cooler evenings, if you put your little homemade greenhouse over the top of those plants, you might be able to prolong the life of those plants a little bit. We also have cloches as an option. So the picture here on the bottom right, that's a traditional glass cloche. Most people just cut the bottom off of a plastic milk jug or water jug, and then you just stick the whole thing over the top of your plant. You can leave the lid on, and then during the day, just go out, unscrew the lid. So if it does get, right now it's still, like some days are 65 and some are 80. So if we hit an 80-degree sunny day, you might want to go out and take the cap off and let some air flow. But if we have really cold days, as we get to December and January, leaving the cap on so that the plant stays nice and secure and stays warm inside. And then cold frames are that bottom left photo. And these are pretty substantial ones. They're built up, it looks like, with like 2x8s or 2x10s, pretty tall. And then you would fill that with soil and then create your lid that can be propped open, again, for nice warm days to let some airflow. Really cold, windy days, or if it's snowing or sleeting or something like that, you would want to keep it closed. So things like this with this cold frame, if you plant your lettuces and spinach and stuff like that in there, spinach in a cold frame, you could wait until probably the end of October, middle to end of October, and plant your spinach in there. let it keep the lid closed so it can germinate. That'll keep it all nice and warm. It'll germinate and start growing, and then you can harvest it. And it will continue to grow. You can cut that several times, generally like 5 times. In the summer, when you grow spinach or lettuce greens, or in the late spring, at least when it isn't super hot yet, you can usually get like 5 cuttings off of some of the lettuce greens. And usually you have to cut them back at least once a week, and they'll regrow really quickly. Through the winter, with our fewer daylight hours, it's going to be a little bit longer. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about how much you need to grow to actually feed yourself, if that's one of your goals. You'll probably need to plant more salad greens for getting through the winter than you normally would for spring and fall. So just because they're going to take a little bit longer to grow between cuttings. So just keep that in mind, or just, start small and try it out for the first year and see what happens. That's also fine. With cold frames are just really great. You can use them in the summer, if you make it so that the lid is detachable, then this is just a nice raised bed that you can use. And then adding that cover in the summertime, you can switch out that lid to have like a screen on it instead of the plastic, and that'll help keep the bunnies out. So cold frames are a really good investment if you are really trying to grow food year round. Okay, and then cover crops. Cover crops are a really good thing to grow, and fall is a really good time to plant them. So throughout the season, as you grow all of your different vegetables, all of the plants are pulling nutrients out of the ground, and cover crops will help put some of those nutrients back into your soil. So they help protect the soil by holding on to it. And when we have, heavy snowstorms or rain throughout the fall and winter, and there's nothing growing on your gardens, the soil can be swept away or blown away. At least here in Central Illinois, we get really strong winds being on the prairie flatlands. So we want to hold on to all of the soil that we can. Cover crops can also help hold nutrients. So as the rains and the snow melts and goes through the soil, the nutrients will bond to the water molecules and be carried away. So when there's nothing on the land growing, those nutrients are just washing away. So we don't want that to happen. We want to hold on to all of the nutrients that we can. And then some cover crops can actually add nutrients. So things like our clover and peas, these are legumes, and they will actually pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and store it in their roots. And then when you kill and till in that cover crop come spring, those roots start to break down and start to release that nitrogen, as well as everything that grew and is holding on to the nutrients. It's taken those up into the plant. And so when you terminate those in the spring and till them in, those plants also start to break down and slowly release those nutrients back to your vegetable crops that you have planted and are trying to grow come next year. So cover crops are a really great option. You do want to plant them, as it says here, about 4 to 6 weeks before the first frost. So here in Central Illinois, our first frost is October 15th, as I mentioned before, or predicted to be October 15th. So you really want to plant today or 2 weeks ago. But I think our prediction is that we'll be warm a little bit longer. So there should be plenty of time for those plants to germinate and start growing before we really get our first really heavy frosts. And then in the spring, you want to mow before the plants put on a seed head, because then you've just created a weed for yourself probably. So we really want to make sure that the plants don't go to seed. So they will germinate now and take root and start to grow, but then with the cold through the winter, they'll really stall out. And then as it starts to warm up come spring, they'll grow really quickly and put on a seed head. So just keep an eye on that. If we happen to have a really warm winter, which isn't predicted for this year, but if we have a really warm winter, they could start putting on seed heads at the end of February or beginning of March. So it's just something to keep an eye on. Don't completely forget about them. come next year, you just want to look out for that. And then you want to till it into the soil 4 weeks before planting. So if you want to mow this down, you know, mow it, or if it's a smaller area, you can use a weed whip or clippers. Even if you are growing it in like a raised bed or something, you can just use clippers, cut it down, and then just start to work it in so it has enough time to terminate and start to break down before you put your plants into it. And then at the bottom, I have some examples of things that you can use as a cover crop, but a lot of the seed companies sell a mix. So for some of our Master Gardener gardens, we just purchased a winter cover crop seed mix, and it came with clover, peas, I think it had Sudan grass and rye, I can't remember, but it had like 4 different things in it. So you don't have to know exactly all of the plants you want in there. You can get a mix, you just spread it and let it take hold. And then the other one listed here is tillage radish. So that's something that will grow. Tillage radish is not very good to eat, but it is a radish that will grow 3, 4, 5 feet deep and anywhere from 3 to 6 inches around. So it's really good for breaking up really hard panned soils, which can happen if you're in an area of new construction where there were lots of dump trucks and large machinery moving over your land. You might need something really to kind of break up your soil. Or if you just in general have a heavy clay soil, which parts of the area that I'm in do, this is a really good thing to just help break up that soil and get some organic matter really deep. So you plant these, they will start to grow. They actually die over the winter from the cold weather, and they will start to break down over the winter. So they aren't going to bind up your tiller or anything like that come spring. They should be pretty broken down already. Okay, and then we have garlic. So we want to plant garlic about 3 weeks after our first frost. So here in Central Illinois, that is November 5th. For our Rockford area, that would probably be a little bit earlier. And then, so probably the last week of October. And then Southern Illinois, St. Louis area, we're going to be about 2 weeks later or even more. So this is one where you know when the first frost has happened. They'll announce it on the news, and then you can plan from there. So this one is a little more solid on when to plant. You don't want the ground to be completely frozen yet. Obviously, that would make it difficult to plant. So if the first frost happens and then suddenly it is going to be 20 degrees for the foreseeable future, you don't want to wait 3 weeks. You want to get it in the ground before the ground totally freezes. So this is one to really watch the weather on. Garlic really likes loose loam soils, which parts of this area have. So parts of it have nice loose loam soils and parts have really heavy clay soils. So nice loose loam soils so that it drains. If it's holding too much water throughout the winter, the garlic bulbs will start to rot, and we don't want that to happen. When you plant it, you take 1 clove. So what we can see in this bottom photo, that is a whole head of garlic and each piece is a clove. So you just want 1 of those and you put the root side down and the top of it up, just as it would grow, the regular plant. So you just break that apart, push all of those into the ground about 4 inches apart, depending on what type of garlic you want. You just want to make sure, obviously, it has enough room to grow. And then 2 inches deep. And then we want to cover it with 6 inches of straw. So that is for here in Illinois and further north where it gets really cold. You just want to make sure that it has a nice blanket on it so that it doesn't freeze and thaw too much. The temperature changes are a little bit more subtle. If it does that too much, it can push the clove out of the ground. And if it's laying on top of the ground, obviously it's not going to start growing come spring, which that has happened here before for even farmers of garlic that have lost a whole crop because we got really cold and then we got kind of warm, and it goes back and forth sometimes. So you really want to make sure you have a good layer of mulch on your garlic. And we do have two types of garlic, so hard neck and soft neck garlic, which you can see in this bottom photo. The soft neck garlic is what you generally find in the grocery store. So it's going to store a lot longer. It does have the smaller cloves of garlic and several more, generally a lot more cloves per head. The hard neck garlic is going to form a scape. So that's what most of the other photos are of hard neck garlics. It's easier to grow. It's more cold hardy. So this is a good one for growing in the Midwest and planting it in November. It tends to have a better survival rate, but it only stores for about 6 months. So that's why you don't see it in the grocery store as much, but it has a stronger flavor, a really lovely flavor. And then the cloves are a lot larger, which for me is really great because anytime a recipe says 2 cloves of garlic, I usually use like 12. So with the hard neck garlic, I usually just kind of stick to what it says because it's assuming I'm using smaller grocery store stuff. And then I have these nice, beautiful, larger cloves that we can use. So I really love hard neck garlic. If you are buying garlic from a grocery store, it has potentially been sprayed with something to prevent it from sprouting. So you might not be able to buy garlic at a grocery store and then plant it. If you can find some from a local grower or at your farmer's market, you can probably just plant whatever you have in your pantry right now. Or you can also purchase individual cloves from seed companies to plant in your garden. The hardneck garlics will form this scape, which you can see in the top 2 photos. So when it starts to form the scape, which is usually like the beginning of June, it's sort of right before harvest because that is the plant sort of forming its flower. Once it forms its flower, it thinks that it has completed its life cycle and it will start to die. So usually late May, beginning of June, it'll form that scape. And just so that it's putting as much energy as possible into the clove before harvest, you do want to harvest those scapes. They are edible. A lot of people will make a pesto out of them, which is really delicious. Or I just chop them up and use them as I would scallions and mix them into pretty much anything that I make or add them to the top of a salad. So they're really versatile. So you just want to harvest those. And then when about half of the leaves have dried for Central Illinois, this will be late June, you can go ahead and harvest that garlic. And then you want to cure it. So to cure it, this is sort of the middle photo on the right. You just want to lay it somewhere with good airflow, generally for curing, say about 85 degrees, good airflow for about a week. You don't want to wash it or anything like that. Just harvest it, lay it out. As it dries, the dirt will also dry. So then when it's done, you can kind of shush off all of that soil, cut the rest of the stem off, and then it's ready for storage. And again, the hard neck will only store for about 6 months after it's been cured, and soft neck up to a year. Okay, and I think that is it. We have some additional resources listed here. You don't have to start scribbling or anything. We are sending this out in an email immediately following this presentation. And then some more, again, these will also be in that email. And that is all. So I will stop this screen share.